It was 2:17 a.m. when the first alarm failed inside the prison's oldest cell block. The sound should have triggered a lockdown, steel doors slamming shut, boots pounding concrete, order restored by force. Instead, there was only silence. Heavy, wrong, the kind of silence that makes trained men hesitate before turning a corner. A guard lay face down near the east corridor, his radio crushed beneath his cheek, the red emergency light blinking against the polished floor. No blood, no visible wounds, just fear frozen into his open eyes. By the time backup arrived, it was already over. Whatever had happened inside that block wasn't a riot. It wasn't a fight. It was a message, and every inmate knew exactly who sent it. The prison had been built to control monsters, thick stone walls, iron bars forged decades earlier, a system designed on the belief that structure, routine, and punishment could bend even the worst men into submission. For years, it worked, at least on paper. Guards held keys. Wardens held authority. Inmates followed rules or paid the price. But power has a way of shifting quietly. No one noticed at first. Not when food trays started arriving late to certain cells. Not when guards avoided eye contact with specific inmates. Not when whispers replaced shouts in the corridors. Fear doesn't announce itself. It seeps in. By the time officials realized something was wrong, the prison no longer belonged to them. The investigation began before dawn. State officials sealed the block. Internal Affairs arrived with notebooks and questions no one wanted to answer. The warden stood stiffly in his office, staring at a wall map that suddenly felt useless. On paper, he commanded every inch of the facility. In reality, there were sections he hadn't walked through in months. They reviewed footage first. Cameras flickered, some feeds cut out entirely, others show. A key witness requested a transfer, then vanished from the system before it could be approved. Someone inside was interfering, someone powerful. The officials felt it now, the same fear that ruled the cell blocks creeping into offices and briefing rooms. Because prisons are supposed to contain danger, not generate it. And when the balance tips, it doesn't just affect inmates, it affects everyone. The warden called an emergency meeting. "We restore order now," he said, slamming his hand on the table, "or we lose this place completely." But restoring order meant confronting something the system hated admitting, that the law had already lost once. Guards had followed rules while inmates rewrote them. Authority had been ignored long enough to become irrelevant, and the longer it stayed that way, the more brutal the correction would have to be. History had shown this before. When control is surrendered quietly, it's never reclaimed gently. Late that night, investigators searched a sealed storage area beneath the oldest wing, a space marked on blueprints but rarely used. The door was locked with a key that should not have existed. They forced it open. Inside were ledgers, notebooks, carefully kept records written in neat, patient handwriting. Names, dates, debts, punishments carried out for disobedience. A shadow justice system. At the bottom of the last page, 10 initials were written in a single line. Not signatures. A warning. Because whoever had built this system never planned to hide forever. And as the investigators stood there, realizing the prison had been ruled from the inside for years, one truth became impossible to ignore. The chains hadn't failed. They had simply been replaced. And somewhere above them, behind locked doors and silent cameras, the 10 inmates who commanded the prison already knew the investigation had begun. What they would do next was going to decide who survived it. By morning, the prison no longer felt like a place of confinement. It felt like a city under occupation. Word of the ledgers spread faster than any official report. Guards whispered in pairs. Administrators locked their doors. Even the most hardened inmates watched the corridors with new caution, unsure who was listening now, unsure which side of the wall truly held power. The 10 initials found in the basement were never spoken aloud. They didn't need to be. Everyone already knew. The task force expanded within hours. State investigators were joined by federal oversight. Men and women who had spent careers dismantling organized crime, corruption rings, and underground economies. They brought experience, authority, and confidence. Yet the moment they stepped inside the prison, that confidence thinned. "This place feels off," one investigator said quietly, scanning the tiers. "Like it's watching us." They began with interviews. The first inmate summoned was supposed to be cooperative. Low-level offender, no gang affiliation, someone easy. He sat calmly across the metal table, hands folded, eyes steady. "Who's running this block?" the investigator asked. The inmate smiled faintly. "You already know. We need names. You already have them." The interview ended when the inmate leaned forward and whispered, "You won't get a second chance." 2 hours later, he was found unconscious in the shower room. No witnesses, no camera footage. The report would later say, "accidental fall." No one believed it. The 10 inmates never appeared together. That was their brilliance. They stayed separated across units, classifications, and security levels. Yet their influence overlapped perfectly. Where one lacked reach, another filled the gap. Where violence drew attention, silence finished the job. They communicated without messages, without phones, without notes. He was older than most, convicted of a nonviolent crime that had once baffled the public financial manipulation on a scale so large it collapsed entire communities. Inside prison, he never raised his voice, never threatened anyone. Yet men twice his size stepped aside when he passed. Investigators called him in under the pretense of a routine audit. "You're not violent," the lead investigator said. "Yet everyone's afraid of you. Why?" The man adjusted his glasses. "Because violence is inefficient. You're part of this." He smiled politely. "I'm part of reality." The investigator slid the ledger photos across the table. For the first time, the man's expression changed, not fear, not anger, but disappointment. "You shouldn't have gone down there," he said softly. That night, the storage basement flooded. A burst pipe, maintenance claimed. The ledgers were destroyed. Every page, except one. The surviving page was enough. It listed consequences, not crimes, not orders. Outcomes: transfers denied, injuries timed to court dates, evidence misplaced at critical moments, careers ended quietly, lives redirected. This wasn't just control over inmates, it was control over the system itself. The 10 didn't fight the law, they absorbed it. The task force argued behind closed doors. "If we push harder, someone dies," one official warned. "If we stop, they win," another shot back. The warden sat in silence, staring at the page. "This prison was meant to hold them," he said finally. Instead, it taught them patience, taught them leverage, taught them that fear lasts longer than force. Then came the escalation. A fire alarm blared during evening count in a unit housing none of the 10. Smoke filled the air. Panic spread. Guards rushed in. In the chaos, one investigator was stabbed not fatally, but deliberately. The weapon was crude. The timing perfect. A message. When the smoke cleared, written on a cell wall in charcoal, were 2 words: "Back off." The attack changed everything. Federal authorities authorized emergency measures, lockdowns intensified, external oversight increased. The prison became a fortress overnight. And still, the 10 remained untouched. Because every move against them triggered something worse: a lawsuit, a riot threat, a staff walkout. It became clear that removing them one by one wouldn't work. They weren't individuals anymore. They were a network. Late one evening, as rain hammered the outer walls, the lead investigator received an unmarked envelope under his office door. Inside was a single photograph. It showed him, weeks earlier, entering the prison. Taken from inside. On the back, written in careful ink, was a sentence that stopped his breath. "You are inside our walls now." And as he stared at the photo, the truth settled in heavy and unavoidable. This investigation was no longer about exposing the 10 inmates who commanded the prison. It was about whether the system itself could survive them. Because the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous the truth became. And someone very close to the investigation was about to choose a side. The decision was made at 3:41 a.m. No press releases, no committees, no warnings. If the 10 inmates ruled the prison as a network, then the network would be severed all at once. A full extraction. Federal authority overrode state control. Tactical teams were staged outside the walls under the cover of darkness. Transfer orders were signed in ink that could not be erased. Each of the 10 would be removed simultaneously, sent to separate facilities across the country, places so isolated that influence would suffocate before it could spread. On paper, it was flawless. In reality, it was already too late. The first extraction began without resistance. Cell doors opened. Shackles locked. One inmate walked calmly between armed officers, eyes forward, breathing steady. No threats, no last words. The second smiled as he was cuffed. The third asked politely for his glasses. The fourth didn't move until told twice, then stood, slow and deliberate, as if memorizing the corridor. By the fifth, something felt wrong. Radios crackled with overlapping voices. Units reported delays. One transport vehicle wouldn't start. Another had the wrong paperwork inside its sealed envelope. Still, the operation continued, because stopping now would mean admitting fear. The sixth inmate leaned close to a guard as the chains were secured. "You really think this ends anything?" he asked. The guard didn't respond. By the seventh, alarms began sounding in a different wing, unrelated, they said. A distraction, a coincidence. By the eighth, a fire suppression system activated unexpectedly, flooding an entire block and forcing officers to reroute. The ninth extraction never happened. His cell was empty, the bed untouched, the camera feed frozen on a still frame from 6 hours earlier. No breach recorded, no exit logged. He had vanished inside the most controlled environment in Hall, he stated. And the 10th inmate, the 10th, was waiting. He sat on his bunk, hands folded, facing the door before it opened. "You're late," he said. The lead investigator stepped forward, weapon lowered, but ready. "It's over," he said. "You're done." The man studied him for a long moment. "No," he replied gently. "I'm finished." Chains locked. The door closed behind them. For the first time since the investigation began, the prison felt quiet, not tense, empty. The transfers rolled out just before sunrise. 6 inmates departed successfully. One was hospitalized en route after suffering a sudden medical emergency. One transport vehicle was rerouted due to an external threat that never materialized. One inmate was officially listed as unaccounted for. And only one arrived at his destination. The man with the glasses. Within 48 hours, the fallout began. A guard collapsed during roll call, dead from an undiagnosed heart condition. A prosecutor assigned to the case announced his resignation without explanation. An evidence technician was arrested for unrelated charges, discrediting months of work. The task force dissolved quietly. No arrests were announced. No charges filed. The official conclusion stated that institutional failures, not individual actors, were to blame. The prison returned to routine. But it was not the same routine. Inside, inmates spoke less. Guards enforced rules again, but carefully, selectively, like men who had learned where not to push. Fear hadn't vanished. It had adapted. 3 months later, the lead investigator sat alone in his office, packing files into boxes marked closed. He hadn't slept properly since the operation. He still saw the empty cell in his dreams. Still heard the question whispered through chain links. "You really think this ends anything?" As he locked his desk, he noticed it's something taped underneath. A small envelope, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, precise. It listed 10 names. 9 of them were crossed out. 1 was not. Below the final name was a line of text that made his hands shake. Order must live somewhere. The news broke quietly. A federal facility thousands of miles away reported unusual compliance issues. Inmates following instructions too perfectly. Guards hesitant to discipline certain individuals. Whispers spreading without words. At the center of it all was a man recently transferred in. Nonviolent history. Clean record inside. Respected instantly. Feared immediately. The man with the glasses. Back at the original prison, the missing 9th inmate was never found. No remains. No escape record. No explanation. His cell was eventually reassigned, but inmates refused to sleep there. They said the light flickered at night. They said footsteps echoed when no one was walking. They said the prison remembered him. The final report concluded that the system had prevailed. But anyone who worked behind those walls knew the truth. The chains never ruled the prison. Fear did. And fear doesn't disappear when you remove men. It waits, learns, moves. Because somewhere in America, behind reinforced doors and unblinking cameras, a new ledger was already being written cleaner, smarter, harder to trace. They thought the most dangerous inmates were behind bars. They never considered what would happen when the bars weren't the ones in control. And if this story made your skin crawl, subscribe if you dare. Because once you step inside these walls, fear follows you out. Like, comment, and stay with us. If you can handle the truth,